You may have noticed that last December, the University of Greenwich issued a trigger warning relating to the poem The Ancient Mariner, due to its, and I quote, depiction of animal death and supernatural possession. I therefore feel that I should also give a trigger warning. In 2016, I had the great honour of giving this talk at the Belgian Embassy in London. Guests included senior diplomats and military bigwigs. More than one reached surreptitiously for their handkerchief. So my content warning is to have a hanky to hand as I talk about a subject very dear to my heart, war poetry. However, and I hope that this will not be a disappointment, not about Rupert Brooke, Siegfried Sassoon, Edward Thomas et al., although if you listen very carefully, you will find that Wilfred Owen does have a bit part, but instead about a different group of poets whose work has been overlooked for over a century. When war was declared in 1914, thanks to the Education Acts of the end of the 19th century, some 96% of the population, according to Queen Mary University London, was literate. Literacy rates were higher among women and girls than among men and boys. In case you're wondering what this has to do with war poetry, I'll explain a little further. Poetry was, in the early years of the 20th century, hugely popular. It featured in magazines, newspapers, journals. Anthologies could be bestsellers, and in times of trauma, people would express their thoughts in poetry. And the years 1914 to 1918 were certainly traumatic ones. So, whilst the theme of this evening's talk is indeed war poetry, it is war poetry written by women and girls who had every bit as much to say about the tumultuous events that were shaping their world, and they had as much to say as their male counterparts. But to get this into some sort of context, I'd like to begin by telling you two anecdotes which do have a bearing on the subject. The first relates to my family connection with the Great War and with Belgium. My grandfather served throughout the war as an army surgeon based near Saint-Omer in France. He was seconded to the Royal Flying Corps. He had a long-standing close friend in the Belgian army. And when my mother, who parenthetically spent her twilight years in Bath, was born, probably the result of his embarkation leave, grandfather asked this Belgian friend to be her godfather. So let's now fast forward 12 years to the unveiling of the Menin Gate, the great memorial to the missing at Ypres in 1927. One very privileged child was taken by her godfather to attend the ceremony, an event she always remembered and would frequently talk about. Latterly, whenever I told her I was visiting Ypres, or Wipers, as it was known to millions of servicemen and women, on cue she would say, "You do know that I went to the unveiling, don't you, darling?" To which I replied, also on cue, "Yes, and you are casting on the way." Family history so often combines the ridiculous and the sublime. The second anecdote relates to my teaching English literature A-level in adult education. There were a few liberating years in the 1990s when, as long as they formed part of the English literary heritage, no trigger warning was needed in those days, tutors could choose the material upon which coursework assignments were based. One fateful September evening, I told my class of predominantly female students that they would be studying a selection of women's war poetry. A sea of disbelieving, astounded faces surrounded me. The women rather surreptitiously looked at each other. Eventually, a brave soul echoed my words. Women's war poetry, the question mark and the capital letters were audible. I was informed that the war poets, audible capital letters, were Rupert Brooke, Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon. They were there. Yet another capital letter. We'd like to study them. Refusing to bow under pressure, I showed the class the then recent Channel 4 documentary, The Roses of No Man's Land. Mesmerised by the harrowing eyewitness accounts of these now very elderly ladies who had nursed during the Great War The class sat in stunned silence as the final credits rolled. It was obvious that these nurses had been in the midst of the blood, the suffering, and the horror that hitherto was accepted as the masculine reserve of the war. The mood altered dramatically. Perhaps women poets might have something to say about the war. My students soon wanted to know more. Who were these women? What were their backgrounds, education, ages? Were there more women poets than the ones they were studying? Were they writing about their own experiences? Were the poems, other than the nurses' ones, true? As we got to grips with the poems, it was soon obvious that we were glimpsing the tip of a poetic iceberg. Submerged beneath it was a body of under-researched, indeed unresearched, women's literary history. Often unable to fully answer my now over-enthusiastic students' questions, it was time for me to learn more. I enrolled in a University of Essex evening class about the First World War, but to my dismay, each student had to lead a seminar on a Great War topic. Racking my brains about what I might know about the war that my fellow frighteningly knowledgeable students did not, I found myself back at the beginning. Women's war poetry. To my surprise, this initially sceptical group were also fascinated. The course tutor commented that this could be an interesting PhD topic. Why not contact Essex History Department? They said, it's war poetry, but not in the anticipated sceptical tone, very much the opposite. They even offered me a bursary, and suddenly I found I had enlisted for the duration, which in this case was 3 years. I had heard of midlife crises. Maybe I was having one. On the scale of things, mine seemed relatively harmless, although my daughters and my husband, who now found themselves sharing their home with countless dead women, may disagree. An early discovery was that of the over 2,000 British poets whose work was published during the Great War, more than a quarter were women. But don't worry, I'm not going to talk about all 500 of them this evening and their war service, although given half a chance and a few days, I would do willingly. If initially this figure seemed amazing, it soon became obvious that as this was a total war, women must have written about it. Although with one notable exception, women did not bear arms, they experienced at first hand the waves of patriotism, excitement, resignation, despair, grief, and finally muted relief that swept the nation for 4 long years. If poetry is a response to intense emotions, it would have been deeply surprising if women had not written war poetry. This point seems to have escaped most literary critics, who still have a tendency to dismiss women poets as, at worst, irrelevant, and at best, peripheral. The shibboleth of gender is such that, in wartime, women's views and voices are considered secondary to war's main business and its poeticization, namely the killing of males by males. Yet, women's poetry is often broader than men's, reflecting how warfare involves far more than writing about the trenches and the camaraderie of those who lived and died in battle. Women's poems, which now initially seemed surprising to me, but became very obvious why, were as widely published as the men's, and unusually for the time, at least as far as war poetry was concerned, newspapers, publishers, and editors were gender blind. The first woman's war poem appeared in the Times Literary Supplement of the 14th of August, 1914, the avant-garde of hundreds of others to appear in all printed media. Entitled Belgia Barlas, it shows Belgium grimly hanging on, knowing that whilst her 123,000 men-at-arms cannot defeat the enemy, she can at least delay his advance, whilst the numerically superior French and British expeditionary forces muster. Whilst Duclos lauded the tiny Belgian army's steadfastness, British poet Beatrix Bryce Miller's focus was upon the original 7 divisions of the regular British army, caught up in the retreat from Mons of late August, early September 1914. Beatrix had enrolled as a lady volunteer with the British Red Cross and was one of the first female volunteers to reach France in August 1914. To the vanguard opens in suitably for the time heroic fashion, "O little mighty force that stood for England." It was widely published and very popular, and, like Duclos, Miller lauds those early regular soldiers, battered, smashed, and shaken, upon whom she, as she saw it, depended the destinies of Europe. She dedicated the rest of her life, and indeed significant sums of money, to the preservation of the memory of the men of the 1914 regular army who have been immortalized as the Old Contemptibles. As an aside, she was mentioned in Sir Douglas Haig's dispatches in 1917 for her work with the Red Cross in France, where she remained throughout the war. One of the first poets who would have had intimate knowledge of the human cost of those opening battles was Mary Boyle. Her brother David was killed on the 26th of August 1914, his body never found. It is hard to know if her line, "A hero's death, they say," is intended ironically. She accepts that with the loss of this brother who was her soulmate, she is left to suck the bitter dregs of life alone. Mary's paralyzing sense of loss leaps off the page a century after she picked up her pen to compose what she called wreathed sonnets, which were her grave gift to her beloved brother David. Sisters' pride in and grief for their brothers is one of the most under-researched areas of the Great War. Yet poetry provides insight into how those who, according to one bereaved sister, were left somewhere in the background, shows how they came to terms with the loss of their childhood companions and a shared history to which only they were privy. Of course, David, like most of the officers of the 1914 regular army, was from a socially privileged background, brought up by a nanny who featured in Mary's sonnets, and, as we're in Bath, home of the Norland nanny, let's pause briefly to consider nannies. Their status in the grief hierarchy is arguably the most ambiguous of all. As one of this army of Victorian not quite servants, not quite members of the family, they dedicated their lives to caring for other women's children. One commented, "Their medals to their mothers, the honour and the pride. We too, with arms as empty, remembering, have cried. They were our dimpled babies. We watched their infant cradles. God guard their soldiers' sleep." With things going badly at the front and casualties mounting, by mid-September 1914, British women were flocking to Belgium in various unofficial volunteer capacities. Many witnessed the plight of the Belgian refugees fleeing the German advance. Caught up in the retreat from Antwerp, novelist and poet May Sinclair was haunted by the tragedy which unfolded before her eyes. So haunted that, "At night, I cannot sleep in England here, but I get up and I go, not to the city of Flanders, not to the city of Bruges or the city of Antwerp or the city of Ghent, but somewhere in the fields, to the house with the slender door, standing low and alone in the flat Flemish land." Of course, the majority of British women's first contact with the war was the agonizing moment of farewell to a beloved husband, son, fiancé, brother, or indeed with army nurses as well as female volunteers who were serving overseas from the very beginning, farewell to a daughter or sister. Multiple poems on this very feminine theme take us to the heart of the women's war. Winifred Letts saw troops leave Dublin for France in August 1914, against the beating of the martial drum. "There's a woman sobs her heart out with her head against the door, for the man that's called to leave her. There's a mother who stands watching for the last look of her son. For most women, the last, all too often final goodbye was at a train station. Alexandra Grantham, who in late February 1915 bid her eldest son farewell, advises mothers, when their sons towards far fights are starting, by the large train be mirth, not moan of fears. Good wishes, agony of farewell kisses, as they together for the last time stand. The green flag waves, the white steam hisses, love's last fond greetings waved with trembling hands. Only when the train has steamed away can the woman allow herself the release of tears. Other female poets knew they had insufficient self-control. Their farewell would take place in the privy of the home, for not all can be the heroine that others are. Women in the Great War are invariably associated with knitting. Lord Kitchener was only too aware that the hundreds of thousands of men who had agreed that your country needs you themselves needed socks, lots of them, 300,000 pairs to be precise, by Christmas. He at least realised that the war would not be over by then. Jointly with Queen Mary, an appeal was put out to the women of the Empire. Idle moments would no longer be tolerated. Instead, do your bit, knit a stitch. By November 1914, English women and children, supported by those in the Dominions, had produced over 700,000 pairs of socks and thousands of other knitted garments. Australian sheep became slightly concerned, according to this poet. Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was quite expensive. It followed her to school one day and came home looking pensive. The little maids at school that day forgot their suits and letters. They pulled the wool off its back and knit it into sweaters. Knitting could be therapeutic, as one poet observing her mother poignantly noted, it's not a sock she's knitting, it's a web of love for him. With the sock crisis under control, by 1915, England was facing a munitions one. Now, women of England had to do their bit and become the girl behind the man behind the gun. Munitions making became the most controversial area of women's participation in the war effort. For some, factory work offered real opportunities for self-improvement and what we would now call upskilling. After years of skivvying and working as low-paid servants, and the majority did not, of course, work in the cosy, downstairs atmosphere of Downton Abbey, a job in a munitions factory promised better wages and the acquisition of skills. Although some middle-class women who lost their servants to the factories were quick to pour scorn on the aspirations of those who joined what became known as Lloyd George's munitions army. Several poems spitefully reflect this attitude. Mummy does the housework, can't get any maid, got to make munitions because it's better paid. Thereby maligning many munitions workers whose wages were far from the riches reported by inter alia, the Daily Mail. Many workers even subscribed to the various government-devised schemes which encouraged the population to subsidise the war. One munition worker explains, we're working on munitions to help to win the war. Now England needs more money, so has called on us once more. Right gladly would we aid her by giving of our own. That's why we're so busy putting money in war loan. Black humour, so much a part of trench life, also occurred in the factories where explosions and fatalities became all too familiar. Perhaps to hide their own grief for comrades at a factory in Scotland, some little Dornoch girls explain how 7 little Dornoch girls did some NG mix. One was overcome with fumes, and then there was 6. All too soon, 3 little door-knock girls went to work quite new. The acid fumes did smother one, and then there were 2. Estimates suggest that around 1 million women worked in munitions, with well over 300 dying as a direct result of explosions and accidents, and unknown numbers dying from poisoning, suffering life-changing illnesses and health conditions, including what we now recognise as shell shock or PTSD. Some poets were affronted by women's involvement in manufacturing the weapons of death, believing that women's hands should minister unto the flame of life, and munitions work taints all that womanhood should stand for. Irrespective of a poetical theme, there is never one universal response. Just as there were over 500 female poets, there were multiple interpretations of the war and women's involvement. This is Lottie Mead, who died of TNT poisoning when she was on active duty, leaving behind 5 children and a husband at the front. He was unable to get home for her funeral, and in fact, Dr. Bernardo stepped in to assist with looking after the children. He survived the war, and after the war, when the Imperial War Museum asked for photographs for their women's work collection, asked for photographs of women who had served during the war, he sent in his photograph of Lottie, pleading that the original be returned to him because he couldn't afford a second one. And Lottie became actually one of the faces of the Great War during the centenary years, and here she is on a postage stamp, which I think would have rather surprised the family if they knew that Lottie, who was a very low, impoverished background, had actually become a stamp in during the centenary years. Even in nursing, a sublimely feminine activity with which few could pick fault, tensions are apparent. Some poet nurses dare to express doubts about their role, for if she is faithful to her trust, she will simply send a man back to satisfy the lust of the war machine. This dichotomy exercised both professionals and volunteers, such as Eva Dobell, who thinks it might have been better in that grim trench to die than drag maimed years out endlessly, recognising that a number also gave their precious wits and would spend the rest of their days in lunatic asylums, as they call, with parenthetically some nurses also suffering traumatic breakdowns and also ending their days in lunatic asylums. Those of us who are familiar with the images of the wounded, the maimed, and the shell-shocked may agree with Eva Dobell. A few nurses' poems highlight the tensions between the professional nurses and the volunteers, or VADs, as many of them were. Whilst not in polite society, pausing over the sold of many alternatives to the acronym VAD, the mother of one member of this voluntary aid detachment sympathised with her daughter Grace, who was periodically referred to as valueless a duffer or very active danger. She understood why, in her unflattering uniform, Grace might have felt virtuous and dumpy, but reminded her that at least in the eyes of her very own NCO, she was verily a darling. Her attempts to be valiant and determined were so impressive that they married after the war. Another VAD whose future was sealed by her wartime experiences was a woman whose name is a household one and who worked in a Torquay hospital. As well as observing the Belgian refugees who were living in Torquay, including a former policeman, one Jacques Amois, who would be immortalised as the great Belgian detective Hercule Poirot, Agatha Christie was being trained by the Red Cross in pharmacy. Her novels are often predicated upon the properties of various poisons, but her poetic pen captured her experiences in a dispensary where there are glistening salts and shimmering scales and crystals of purest white, high on shelves in their spotless rows, enclosed in their bottles bright, salts of iron, of palest green, of deepening down to brown. Here is sleep and solace and soothing of pain, courage and vigor new, but there is also menace and murder and sudden death in these phials of green and blue. As well as studying for her pharmacy examinations, observing Amoir and listening to his stories, Christie was editing her hospital's magazine. Many hospitals found producing magazines was therapeutic for both staff and patients. Christie's colleague and close friend, one Alberta Vicarage, contributed some poems. Alberta has her own claim to fame, although sadly one that is now written out of the male war poetry history books. The widely read at the time Saturday Westminster Gazette frequently set poetry competitions offering a 1 guinea prize, over £100 in today's money. In January 1918, the competition was restricted to those on active service, which naturally included nurses. Second prize went to a budding poet of the Manchester Regiment, one Wilfred Owen. The winner's laurels went to Alberta Vicarage. Not all VADs were nurses. Some, ironically, as many would have been waited on at home by servants, filled lowly domestic roles as general service VADs. They could find themselves working at times of day which in a pre-war existence few barely even knew existed. One addressed an ode to a recalcitrant gas oven which she was supposed to clean. Goodbye at 5 to sleep so sweet. At earliest dawn we used to meet. For you, my hand friend, I had to greet about 5:30. And on flu days, twice weekly treat, you were so dirty. General Service VAD Winifred Wedgwood pleads for her colleagues, the scullions, not to be forgotten in all the hyperbole about VAD nurses. Our nurses are always apparent, so we give them their halos all right. But how many think of our scullions, because they work buried from sight? Over in France and Free Belgium, other British women were doing their bit, including the members of the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry. This unit had been formed pre-war with the optimistic idea that the Fannies, as they were affectionately dubbed, would gallop onto the battlefield to rescue casualties and gallop back, dragging a stretcher behind them. The realities of the Western Front were such that galloping on horseback proved a little bit of a non-starter. So, ever adaptable, these upper-class women transformed themselves into ambulance drivers, initially with the Belgian and eventually the British and French armies. Dedicated, determined and dauntless, showing superb driving skills and utter disregard for their own safety, they tell harrowing stories about driving cargoes of wounded in all weathers and across all terrains. Fannies saw action in both the First and the Second War, and they remain in existence today. I don't know if today's Fannies are budding poets, but their foremothers certainly were, often giving humorous accounts of life then and now. One wished my mother could see me now, with my grease gun under my car, filling my differential ere I start from the sea afar. The conditions that the women worked in were often overwhelming, both mentally and physically, and several received that rare honour from a woman, the military medal. Leave, when it came, was badly needed, although one, little Fanny going back to Blighty, stopped in Paris on the way to buy a naughty nightie. Whilst most British women served in France or Flanders, some voluntary units headed to the war's now forgotten theatres, Serbia, Salonika, and the Russian front. Amongst the best known were the Scottish Women's Hospital Units for Foreign Service, known as the SWH. By 1919, the 14 SWH units and their hundreds of female volunteers had served in all theatres. The unit's administrator, suffragist Mary Henderson, reflects in her poetry on her boundless admiration for her many nursing colleagues, writing in one poem, "I see you kneeling on the wooden floor, tending your wounded on their straw-strewn bed." Her poetry gives a graphic account of the particular challenges women working on these fronts experienced, being so close to the front line that aeroplane duels, which Henderson poetically referred to as fought by birds of menace, took place quite literally over their heads, endangering lives and also the patient's lunch, as the unit's cook, one Mary Milne, bewailed, albeit in prose, not poetry. Throughout the war, serving women forged close bonds with their colleagues. Swore, contrary to what some ill-informed male critics claim, they maintained these bonds through associations, reunions, and newsletters. Some even had their own song, which, to the tune of Duke John Peel, they had initially belted out through young lungs. As they aged, they held association meetings, still singing in frailer voices the lines that reminded them of those days when women too had done what one serving woman referred to as their little bit to win the war. The longest lasting association was the SWH Weaponless Association, whose members served at the Abbey de Weaponless and the nearby temporary hospital, at Villers-Cotterêts, where they were swept up in the last desperate advance of the German army in March 1918. This is at the Abbey de Weaponless, which they took over in 1914. It had seen no renovation for about 150 years, didn't even have any running water, and the women turned it into a functioning hospital, all by women power, in just under 4 weeks. They turned the whole abbey into a hospital that became one of the most respected of hospitals on the entire front. By 1917, if Britain were not to be starved into surrender, a woman's land army had to be created. Once again, women from across the British Isles responded to this latest call for service. One member recalled, "We were summoned from the city, from the cottage and the hall, from the hillside and the valley. We answered to the call, for we were fighting for our country as we tilled its fertile soil. The pay was poor, the hours long, the work arduous and lonely. One member of this newly formed land army wondered if she would be up to the job. I'm a-thinking of the farm where I'll be sent, of the lonely little furrow where my days will oft be spent, of the harmless cows that poets say do naught but chew the cud, though I know when I go milking they'll be sure to have my blood." Despite their misgivings, using what the Ministry of Food referred to as the food bullet, the WLA successfully won the war against starvation and, you won't by now be surprised to hear, committed their experiences to poetry. Whilst the members of the land army both physically and poetically ploughed their lonely furrows, other versifiers turned for inspiration to the land of their birth and hoped that Arcadian images of their homeland might sustain those who were fighting. Perhaps visions of that misty sea-girt island in the sun-haunted west would comfort the wounded and dying. Others recognised that although the land war was being fought across the Channel, those living in England's green and pleasant land were themselves in a new firing line. The skies, hitherto God's last area free from vice, initiate the aerial mind with babes below as sacrifice. Death would henceforth rain down from the skies in what had been referred to as the First Battle of Britain. By now, the guns of northern France and Flanders were also audible in southeast England. Clearly so in Kent, where Enid Bagnall wrote how, when lying in bed at night, there thumps at the heart of the hill, on the house wall, and runs in the grass at the foot of the trees, the reminder, the guns. For Rose Macaulay, who had gained some notoriety for her pacifist novel Non-Combatants and Others, the guns are also omnipresent. During a June 1917 picnic in the Surrey Hills, heavily up the southeast wind, the great guns beat. We did not wince, we did not weep, we did not curse or pray. We drowsily heard and someone said, "They sound clear today." In a line that rather reminds me how a year after the invasion of Ukraine, we now somehow seem to take this latest war on European soil for granted. For Rose and her picnicking friends, where once pity we knew and rage we knew as we stared through the gates of hell, now hell's gates are an old tale, remote the anguish seems, and the picnickers merely commented that as the guns can be heard so clearly, we'll have rain tonight. If Macaulay seems to accept the guns' presence, also writing in spring 1917, Beatrice Mayer feels that, as for many at home, including those in authority, it is impossible to fully imagine the contrast between the front and the breaking buds and singing birds in England. So they go on killing, dying, this evening, and through summer, autumn, winter, and through spring. Whilst civilians at home struggled to fully comprehend the horrors of this first technological war, one who experienced it at first hand was the woman who, in my, of course, unbiased opinion, was the finest war poet of either gender. I'd like to briefly tell you her story. In 1913, Vassar-educated heiress Mary Warden was living in London, unhappily married to a Scottish missionary. An ardent believer in women's suffrage, in the autumn of 1913, she was selected to fling a stone from the windows of the Treasury building. Although to her dismay, 2 stones fell wide of the mark, the third cracked spectacularly and so satisfyingly through the glass. Unsurprisingly, she was arrested. She spent 5 nights in a prison cell before, to her fury, her husband paid her 25-shilling fine and she was released. Heavily pregnant when war was declared, she nevertheless applied to the London Committee of the French Red Cross to become a volunteer nurse. She felt that neither her lack of nursing skills or knowledge of French created insurmountable barriers. After all, babies are born, nursing skills can be acquired, and she felt confident that she could master the rudiments of French while sitting out the pregnancy. In January 1915, recently delivered of her 3rd daughter, May went to Dunkirk and trained in a grim French hospital where hideously wounded and mortally sick French poilus were being, and I hardly like to use the word nurse, in conditions that resembled those of the Crimean War. May was horrified, particularly at the lack of night staff, and when a drunken male orderly was placed in sole charge of 2 wards, her patience ran out. Breaking all French nursing rules about women and night nursing, she organised a rota of night staff amongst the English volunteers. Unsurprisingly, she fell foul of the French authorities, and so she hatched a plan that she would develop her own nursing unit, which would be embedded with the French army, and she would be the directrice. She worked out that the initial cost would be about £4,000, with running costs of £200 per month, which he would fund jointly with the French. To help kickstart this idea that was upsetting her, she relinquished the lease on her Park Lane house and sold all the furniture. I never managed to find out if her husband, who was serving with the Indian Army as an interpreter, knew about this, and she moved herself, her considerable American investments, and her 3 daughters to Paris, thereby relinquishing membership of the British Tax Club. A small footnote is that by the end of the war, her fortune had all but disappeared. In July 1915, the Mairie Board of Mobilier Numéro 1, consisting of 12 long wooden portable huts with reinforced windows to take the strain of heavy firing, was operational. As the name mobile or mobile implies, like all casualty clearing stations, it could be packed up and transported with only a few hours' notice. Soon, the French wounded were pleading to be sent there. The mortality rate of 5% was the lowest of the entire front for this stage of the war. Winter 1915 was grim, and the weather lashed the flimsy huts. May slept beneath a mackintosh sheet with an umbrella propped over her head. Guns and shellfire the constant musical accompaniment. In the late spring 1916, she established her Hôpital de l'Évacuation at Bray-sur-Somme. It would become one of the most important military hospitals in France, and she would soon have a ringside view of the latest technological advances in warfare. In September 1916, May watched in horror as obscene crabs, armoured toads, crushed under their belly whatever stood in their way. These tanks actually lumbered past her hospital on the first day that tanks were ever used in combat. May's hospital had become a city of huts, and the guns beyond the hills sound like the waves of the sea, pounding, pounding, and the sky is a whir with aeroplanes. Sometimes we are bombarded, she wrote, and all the time troops and more troops stream past. Soon these troops would stream back, disfigured, maimed, and with their wits as shattered as their bodies. Determined that her patients would have the best care that she and her 13 hand-picked nurses could give, she again fell foul of the French authorities, who considered a wounded man's uniform more important than his life. At her hospital, uniforms would not automatically be preserved for future use. Instead, they would be cut through with knives or scissors to avoid inflicting additional suffering on the already pain-crazed men, woe betide anyone who tried to stop her. As she and her nurses worked round the clock, one of the many ironies that did not escape May was that it was women who had become the front-line soldiers in the second battlefield, where women fought to save the lives that the first battlefield had sought to destroy. May's wartime private life was as tumultuous and in many ways as gender-reverse as her public one. At Bray, in autumn 1916, Staff Officer Captain Edward Louis Spears, serving away from the front line, paid this frontline hospital an official visit. Her first glimpse of him was of something rare this close to the Somme front, a whole man with all his limbs, eyes, ears, and even a nose intact and in the right place. His of her was of a small woman in a mud-splattered and blood-stained apron. The sonnet she wrote to the man who would soon become her lover and eventually her second husband encapsulates the gender reversal which infuses her magnificent poetry. No, no, there is some sinister mistake. You cannot love me now. I am no more a thing to touch, a pleasant thing to take into one's arms. How can a man adore a woman with black blood upon her face, a cap of horror on her pallid head, mirrors of madness in the sunken place of eyes, hands dripping with the slimy dead? Go, cover close your proud, untainted brow. Go quickly, leave me to the hungry lust of monstrous pain. I am his mistress now. These are the frantic beds of his delight. Here I succumb to him anew each night. Whilst an increasingly shell-shocked May and the 24,000 nurses in Blighty and in every theatre of war ministered to and comforted the dying, those at home could only sit and wait. Well over 7,000 received the telegram or letter that they had dreaded since their loved one had marched off to that beating drum. When that long-anticipated news finally came, many found an outlet in writing. Two of the most moving poems on this theme that I have come across demonstrate the classlessness of grief. Both these women's beloved sons died in the Dardanelles within days of each other. Young Royal Inniskilling Fusilier John Vincent Toy was killed on the 2nd of July 1915. His mother Sarah believed that had he been buried in the local churchyard in Derry,
A reading of In Memory of Private John Vincent Toy. Had he reached home, though sorely maimed, our own precious dear, and friends stood round his bedside as the end was drawing near. Some comfort then we could have got, we knew where he was laid, bedewed the grave top with our tears and keep it bright arranged. Each evening as the sun went down, we could have wandered there, and bending low before our God, have said a silent prayer. Until we meet on heaven's bright shore, we bid adieu for evermore. Till all our earthly sorrows cease, God rest his soul in peace.
Sarah's wish, like that of so many hundreds of thousands of other mothers, was unfulfilled. Her child's body was never found. He had remembered on the magnificent Hillis Memorial at Bahia, Gallipoli. When German-born Alexandra Grantham bade her son Hugo farewell at the station, did she sense that this would be her last glimpse of him? On June the 28th, 1915, he was killed near Gully Ravine, Gallipoli. A multi-talented, highly cultured woman who wrote songs, poetry, and plays. She composed this ode to her 20-year-old lieutenant son, Hugo Grantham of the Essex Regiment. A footnote to Alexandra's story is that although in 1915 one could say that the language there is very heroic and patriotic, by 1918 she is actually turning to being a pacifist and actually refers to young men not leaping into a glorious death, but in fact suffocating on their own vomit. So she's moved completely across the sort of spectrum of heroism to pacifism. And a further footnote to her story is that her youngest son, who was born in 1912, he was killed in the Second World War, and her husband had been killed 6 weeks before Hugo, and she was German. So her grief journey is very complex one, and fascinating to follow how she becomes more and more anti-war and pacifist and maintains that stand in the Second War. Another of the many battles seared into our national consciousness was one that lasted from July to November 1917 at Passchendaele, where men, horses, and materiel disappeared without trace. One of the hundreds of thousands who fought in the ubiquitous mud that Mary Borden referred to as the vast liquid grave of our armies was a 29-year-old second lieutenant. Granted a few days leave on the 17th of September 1917, Guy Patterson Cranmer, former schoolmaster now serving with His Majesty's forces, obtained a special license, allowing him to marry his sweetheart, Elsie Breed, on the 23rd of September. As he had only 6 days leave, there was insufficient time before Guy returned to the front to call the bands. Indeed, within days of the marriage, Guy was back in Passchendaele, his 3-day honeymoon locked away in his precious memory box of home. Following his departure, like many women, Elsie, already bereaved of 2 brothers, had what she termed a premonition. Suddenly, out of the cold and mist and gloom, a gleam of silver moonlight, you were there, beside me in the little narrow room, smiling your old, glad, familiar smile, full of secret sweetness. With a secret fear that this was some foreshadowy wraith of you, I touched your eyes, and then we mutely kissed, not with the fiery kisses as of old, but a sad, dumb, pitiful clinging. For a while no word was said, until you suddenly drew yourself away from me. Strangely you fled, away into the cold and gloom and mist. And then I knew. A telegram arrived. Guy had been killed on the 9th of October, lost in that bitter, heaving mud. Passchendaele robbed Elsie, as it robbed so many women, of the hopes and passions of youth, of dreams of motherhood, and of a life never to be shared with the only man she had ever or would ever love. She was convinced. I shall remember when the years have flown away and left no single visible trace of all your beauty and your body's grace, and you are one with the earth and sky and air. I shall remember how my heart grew cold and dumb with a sick dumbness of despair. And when the last faint, shadowy evening life of life departs from me, when I am taken from the haunts of men, O heart I loved, I shall remember even then. For 60 years, Elsie cherished memories of a marriage that had lasted a total of 15 days, of which 3 had been spent together. This most terrible war conscripted her into the army of what she accurately dubbed the living dead. Finally, after 1,566 days, the war to end war was over. A long 2 years later, on November the 11th, 1920, the unknown warrior was interred at Westminster Abbey. Outside, in the packed streets, the women's eyes are red, those hungry eyes of starving mother love that strive to pierce the coffin lid above the nameless envoy of the nameless dead. Meanwhile, the Imperial War Graves Commission was creating the magnificent cemeteries in which the known and those only known unto God were interred. But thousands of bodies had never been found. They too needed fitting memorials. On the 24th of July 1927, the Benin Gate, the great memorial to the missing of the Ypres Salient, was unveiled in the presence of largely, but far from exclusively, generals, diplomats, royalty, and other worthies, and, if you remember, my own mother. This date indeed was chosen in the Imperial War Grave Commission's own words because of the hundreds of thousands of men who passed through it on their way to the battlefields. The names carved on the panels of Portland stone are those of 57,895 officers and men of the salient, whose bodies were either never found or could not be identified. All who attended the unveiling were graciously welcomed by the residents of Wipers, as pilgrims are to this day, continuing the bond forged in blood and suffering between the citizens of Belgium and the men and women of the British Empire. Whenever I attend the last post ceremony at the Menin Gate, which has been held every evening since the 2nd of July 1928, even during COVID, with one lone bugler and no attendees permitted, demonstrating that this is not, as it is sometimes accused of being a tourist attraction, but a heartfelt tribute to those who gave their lives a century ago. The words of a young VAD, Carola Oman, who worked near Eve in the final months of the war and during the reconstruction, haunt me. He gazed along the Menin Road in March 1919. Over the flat, dim land, I see you moving, methodically, under a dark, wide sky full of low clouds. You are gone from our loving. No fret of ours or grief can touch you now. The road speaks nothing to our longing now. Yet, I wonder, are you wholly gone? For those of us who over a century later are still trying to comprehend the magnitude, the horror, and the suffering of those tumultuous years, the simple lines and the powerful poems written by these amateur and professional women reveal a different story, one told for the first time exclusively through the eyes and lives of those who may have been weaponless, but were not wordless, the female poets of the Great War. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure you would like to ask some questions, but I just want to point out that she has brought all her books with her, and they are for sale, and each one explores a different aspect that she was unable to touch on in tonight's talk. She has a book called Tumult and Tears, an anthology. We Also Served. She also has Nursing Through Shot and Shell, and Suffragism in the Great War, Children at War, Regina Diana, which is about a woman spy, and Women and the Great War, all of which are available. So if you've now formulated your questions, are you prepared to answer?
More than happy, yes. Yeah.
So, thank you very much, Vivien. Wonderful talk. Thank you, John, for your introduction. I will pass the microphone around for any questions. We did have one on the for people watching on Zoom, which I'll ask first. When we think of your questions in the room, which was, Vivien, are there any anthologies of women poets for the Great War that you would recommend?
Well, I would, perhaps I could say I recommend my own, but there's one other anthology of women of poets of the Great War, which is called Scars Upon My Heart, which just is a collection of poets arranged alphabetically. I then felt that the poets needed much more introduction than just a sort of a poem on its own. And so my anthology, Tumult and Tears, gives the background to the poet, the background of the sort of era and what he was doing, and also looks at who published these poets, because that can be quite revealing. In terms of contemporary anthologies, there were the time anthologies were published just with women poets, but they're very, very hard to find. But there's the Scars Upon My Heart, and then my one, which is sort of more up to date. Standing on the Shoulders, the first one, I should say.
So I think the answer to the question is it's Vivien's book. Go to.
Yeah, I wouldn't be biased.
Do you have any questions in? Vivien, can I ask you to repeat the question, or just that will help our online viewers?
I'm just wondering if there's any local connection, if I say local, Bath, Bristol, Western, with any local women poets. I ask as a local historian.
Yes, in terms of connection. Yes, sorry, the question was, are there any local poets, sort of Bath and the southwest area? There was one young woman by name of Vivien Ford, who I used several of her poems. As far as I can tell and remember, she was sort of working locally, but she was very much sort of picking up on what was going on. She, again, to my recollection, I think she was quite religious, and so she tended to sort of look at what was going on in terms of trying to sort of understand out in a sort of religious sense. Yeah, I'm pretty certain that I'm right. Vivien Ford.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Thank you. You talked about the levels of literacy in the army, and obviously the women who went to war. You also mentioned the idea of poetry competitions. How do those two things work together, and were they responsible for the number of poems that were actually written?
Right, the question was levels of literacy, which I mentioned at the beginning, and and the number of poetry competitions that I also mentioned at the beginning, and what extent these worked together. So if we look at the levels of literacy and the prevalence of poetry in the early part of the 20th century, a lot of the English curriculum was actually based around poetry, and poems were taught in schools. Young people had to learn a poem by heart. Some of you might remember doing that at school. I certainly do. It was seen as a good brain trainer. They also studied English grammar through poetry, having to parse different poems. And so poetry was very much part of life. And children were encouraged to write poems, and this carried on into adulthood. Newspapers, always seeing a good way of selling papers, very quickly cottoned on to how popular poetry was during the war, and offered poetry prizes. So I mentioned the one, the Alberta Vicarage one, and Wilfred Owen came second. And you'll find poetry prizes in local newspapers, national newspapers, magazines such as the Saturday Gazette, were very, very popular. And they would often set a theme. I've run out of how many poems entitled Dulce et Decorum Est I have actually read, because quite often they would set one with a Latin tag, for example. Some, you may remember I mentioned the Valueless Seductor that was all constructed around the VAD. Sometimes there would be poems that would be on a particular acronym. So these poetry competitions, some of the local papers were offering prizes of sort of 2 and 6, going up to the national ones that were offering a guinea. And people entered them. I mean, they would have hundreds of entries some weeks. And in fact, one poetry critic commented at the end of the war, if anybody could die from reading poetry, he would be dead because he read 7 cubic meters of it. That's a fair bit of poetry, but it's just this popularity of the genre. And if anybody's a sort of a military historian or interested in Gallipoli, Sir Ian Hamilton, the first commander at Gallipoli, who had a fairly disastrous command, on the opening day of the attack at the Dardanelles, he was actually sitting in his cabin on board reading poetry. and he and his wife had undertaken much of their courtship through exchanging poems. I like this one. What do you think of that one? So poetry was, I saw sometimes referred to the Twitter or the Facebook of the day, actually. But these competitions were a good way, and some people would win 2 or 3 times a year. It's probably supplementing your income from the poem. And if you do one or 2 or 3 it's so much better.
Vivien, I suspect the answer to this may be too obvious in a way, but given that many of us are brought up knowing lots of male poets, First World War, Wilfred Owen mentions, because it's been Robert Great, etc. Why is there no single woman? There doesn't seem to be any woman poet in the First World War who's a Hampton name or who we're taught in school. I suspect they're maybe changing now from my school days, but is there any? What do you think that is? Because some of the examples you gave are poems of poignancy and power and great skill as well.
And the question was, why is it that male war poets have remained so prevalent? And then we've got household names, C.P. Sassoon, Robert Graves, Rupert Brooks, Wilfred Owen, etc. And that there's no female poets up there yet, or in the pattern of poets. And why should this be? I've got a couple of, I've thought about it a lot. And to begin with, when I first started the research, I hoped that I was going to find, the female poet, which I think is Mary Gordon, but the one who summed up the war best and which should be a household name. I think that there are a number of good female poets. There are a number who were writing from the heart, but perhaps would not count as being sort of a literary great poet. But I think that the answer to why are the males up there stems from the anti-women backlash that started in the mid-20s. So if you look at anthologies of poetry, mixed anthologies, male and female poets, that were published 1919, 1920, 1921, you are still finding women in there. As the decade progresses, by the time you get to 1928, you don't find any women in the anthologies. So I think that's partly the answer, that there was a significant backlash against women in the 20s. And I think that they were sort of suddenly seen as the men who had everything to say about the war and not the women. And then by the 1960s, when you're getting the real sort of lions led by donkeys, oh, what a lovely war, that feeling that the First World War had been an absolute waste and a bloodbath, and the men were the lions and the donkeys were the generals. Then it was what I would call the protest poets of the First World War who became prevalent, and the protest poets were in fact in a very significant minority. Throughout the war, you were getting more poets who still feel that it is a war worth fighting, however terrible. And it is just once you get to sort of 64, that was when the real anti-war backlash started. And that's when the protest poets come to the fore, and with a sort of side-side example of Rupert Brooks, because of If I Should Die, I Think Only This Is Me. But that would be my answer. And although there are a significant number of protest women poets, at this stage everybody's forgotten about the women poets and nobody looks for them. But it is changing in schools. There are some females are taught along with the males.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to vacate the building by 9 o'clock, and my colleague Ian Gadd, who's chair of trustees here at Wilsey, is going to say a few words before we finish. But is there a last question from anybody?
Well, maybe just briefly.
Yeah.
When I was young,
Give me this topic. So we can hear you.
People like Seamus Heaney, his famous article on Owen in the TNS, were putting together this kind of violence plus courage equals creativity. It was a kind of obsession amongst the younger poets, well, they weren't young, such as George Macbeth, people like that. It was a cult. Do you think that now we have passed into an entirely new era of thinking about this really rather malevolent violence, courage, creativity.
That's a long question.
Sorry.
That's okay. To give a quick answer, I would think yes. I think probably that we see violence as not necessarily leading to creativity or courage necessarily leading to creativity, but I would need to think about the answer.
Thank you very much. The very fact that you've answered it in that way is wonderful. Thank you. So,
I'm not thinking about, but
okay, I'm going to jump in here. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Professor Ian Gadd, Chair of the Board of Directors here at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution. I'm here formally in this particular moment to thank Vivien, but I just want to say before that I'm here also as a Professor of English Literature. I always welcome the talks that we have on literature, and shamefully, as not dissimilar in age to Joe, for me, the World War I poets were universally male when I was talking about them. And this has been a really eye-opening and moving talk. And the thing that I mean, there are many things that I've taken from this talk, but the ones I really want to highlight and thank you for are the faces and the words that we've heard, because that's what can happen with the past, and particularly where, in the way that you describe, the canon can shift in a way that marginalises and then completely overlooks these poems. So it's so good to hear those voices and see those faces again. So I just want to take a moment to ask you to thank Vivien for a fantastic talk.